My name is Bree Chair, and I'm going to chair this discussion. I've had a long time interest in the topic. As you know, abortion is rarely out of the news, and you might remember that abortion that was made legal in the States in 1973, referred to as Roe versus Wade, but that constitutional right was removed this year and has caused a lot of controversy there and a lot of reaction. And now Congress or individual states have to decide whether to set their own abortion laws. And when asked, people in Kansas recently voted for choice. We obviously, we don't have it particularly easy here, although the circumstances are very different. And abortion has been legal here under certain circumstances since 1967. And recently, telemedicine has made early medical abortion has been made permanent. But protests continue outside abortion clinics, and some places have needed to have buffer zones established. So when it comes to abortion rights, it seems that nothing can ever be taken for granted. So for the next 90 minutes, we're going to explore the future of abortion rights, and I'll introduce you to your speakers in a minute. But as you listen to them, as you listen to what they have to say, consider whether you agree with them or whether you don't, what you'd like to contribute, or points that you'd like to make in response, or even challenge them. But until they're finished, keep your thoughts to yourself until they've all had their say. And then I'll invite you to have yours. I'm going to give very brief introductions to the speakers. You can read their biographies on the Battle of Ideas website. And they will each speak for a maximum of 5 minutes. So in order of speakers, they've sat conveniently in the way that they're going to speak. So on my far left, we have Margot Martin. She's a student at Aberystwyth University, that's in Wales, and she, together with Ella Whelan, who is on maternity leave, have produced this session. Next is Mary Kenny, who's sitting on my right, which is just disproof what I've said. They're not sitting in the order they're going to speak. Mary's a journalist, a playwright, an author, and probably known to many of you. Her latest book, which is on sale outside, is called The Way We Were, Catholic Ireland Since 1922. So you can find her book on the books in the bookstore later. After Mary will be Dervla Murphy, here on my left. She's also a student and researcher, and she's at the University of Kent. And as well as abortion, she's interested in reproductive health, generation, free speech, and gender. And our last contributor will be Dr. Piers Ben. He's a philosopher, author, and lecturer, and he's a very regular contributor to the Battle of Ideas, and you may have seen him a few times already this weekend. Okay, so 5 minutes max, and let's start.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Is the mic on? Great. Thanks for the introduction, Brid. So I'm going to start by how I first reacted to the news that Roe versus Wade fell, and my first reaction was appalled, and I wanted to express that abortion rights should be protected by the right to privacy, and that should be a constitutional right. I'm kind of wanting to advocate that without a democratic process, because that's kind of, I felt so strongly about it. But after having read more about what's happening in the US for the past few weeks, and after having kind of actually sat down and thought about what my original opinion was, I've kind of come to the conclusion that through a democratic process is the only way we can secure that abortion rights are protected. This is, as we see what's kind of unfolding in America at the minute, if we look at Arizona and Ohio, who had trigger laws that banned abortion or made abortion very restrictive as soon as Roe v. Wade fell, These trigger laws have now been blocked by legislation, not permanently, but it's kind of opening the floor to a more democratic process through referendum or through votes in each state's Congress. In Kansas, a deep red state, voted using in my opinion, the most democratic process, a referendum by the population, and they voted to protect abortion rights in one of the most conservative states in the US. Montana went as far as to decide that abortion rights should be protected by privacy law, by the right to privacy, something that I really wanted to advocate. So through democratic process in the US, this has already happened. We've seen in Argentina in 2020, abortion was legalized in Mexico 2021, in Ireland 2018. So the democratic process is the only way to ensure these rights. But what does the democratic process represent? What does it? Why is it so important? And it represents, to me, and how I understand it, the fundamentals of choice. And through choice, which is the expression of our human ability to make really difficult decisions based on our own moral autonomy. So the vote or a democratic process represents this incredibly important part of the human experience. This is expressed, I'm going to refer to my own research. I'm researching Spanish literature at the minute. And in the book that I'm mainly focusing on, the characters are utterly despicable and difficult to even like parts of them. What this does is gives the reader their own agency to decide kind of how they react to the characters' decisions. But it also shows and explicitly shows how throughout the narrative, it's very obvious that the characters could have made different choices along the way. In chapter 1, they could have done a completely different choice that would have made them better people or more likable people. So again, in literature and art, this idea of choice and the fundamental part of democracy is expressed. This brings me to my main headline, I'd like to call it, that I believe that policy should be based on on this democratic fundamental element of choice. So this is because we cannot agree when life begins. We cannot come to a consensus of when we understand life to begin. To some religious people, life begins at conception. To other people, they don't view a personhood, they don't view a fetus as a personhood. A personhood is only granted once it's part of society, which is after birth. And because we cannot decide this, because there is no consensus, we have to base our policies on something that we all, in democratic societies, can agree on, which is choice. This is not difficult to come across in different protests. So in
1 minute.
Thanks. This is explicitly shown in different protests and in different movements towards, in Argentina's case, in the pro-aborto movement, which is their pro-choice movement. Specific language was used, which was, women were using freedom and choice as specific language. So it's very explicit. It's not something you have to dig for. But for me, what's even more interesting in some cases a bit more, they hold more ground, is conservative voices again and again are voicing this importance of choice. In Ohio, the Congressman John Curtis has expressed that women should be making this decision. He, as a man, I don't agree with this line of thought, but he says that he, as a man, shouldn't be making this choice. Women should be. What this shows is he's confronted by the implications of democratic rights. He's facing up to social pressure to understand that in democracy, democracy, women should be making these choices. And my last point, is that out of context of abortion discussions, what's happening in Iran is also shows this. An Iranian wife of a Revolutionary Guard has expressed that she doesn't believe that the morality laws should be upheld on the basis that she hopes that women make the right moral choices. But this cannot be done unless it's done with freedom and freedom of choice. So I'd like to finish with that there is hope. Thank you.
I'm going to stand up so you can see me. Good afternoon. Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, and I say ladies and gentlemen because I adhere to the scientific view that there are two sexes and that sex is biological. In any case, I'm perhaps more suited to talk about the past of abortion rather than the future, since I first encountered this debate in 1966 when my local MP, Lena Jager, Labour Party, Holborn, gave a talk about how there must be abortion law reform. She emphasised at that time the class element of the rather patchy law which existed. She said that a rich woman could go have an abortion because she wanted to go on a ski holiday, but a poor woman couldn't have an abortion even if she lived in a hovel. And she was more, it's very interesting to look at how attitudes change over the years. She was more emphasised really the inequality of that. I think she was more disgusted at the idea of a woman going skiing and being so rich enough to go skiing. But there was at that time, at the time of, leading up to a change in the abortion law, making it more accessible, because it was in a sort of penumbra. There was claims that there were up to 50,000 abortions a year maybe taking place. And I think it was Paul Ferris who wrote a book about that. People said, but that's absolutely shocking. You couldn't possibly have 50,000 abortions a year. That's an exaggeration, surely put about by the pro-life lobby. No, it wasn't actually. That was true. And the prediction was that once the abortion law really came in properly and once there was good birth control, that in fact this would drop. But of course, the most recent statistics are that there are 209,000 abortions every year. So it's actually quadrupled since it became legal. So the notion, which I think Bill Clinton advanced in the 1990s, that abortion should be safe, legal, and rare, perhaps it is indeed safe and legal for women, but rare it isn't, if we look at the statistics. So the picture has changed over the years. And we must bear in mind that in the past, some of the really harrowing and scandalous stories about women having illegal abortions were placed in the context of very little birth control. Annie Ernaux, who's a wonderful French writer, actually, she wrote a terrific book called L'Événement, which has been turned into a movie, about an abortion that she had in 1963. And it really is very, very unsparing. But we must bear in mind that in 1963, France still had an anti-contraception law, actually, a law which had been ushered in 1920 because they were so panicked about the fall in fertility after the First World War. So we put that in that place. Interestingly, too, Brigitte Macron's biographer asserts the reason why she had 3 children back in the 1960s was that you couldn't get the pill in France at that time. And I think that was absolutely true. They didn't change the contraceptive laws in France until 1967. So that was the context of that past. Times have changed and abortion moved from being something that was regarded by many people as regrettable but sometimes necessary into the notion of a right and a choice. And it seems to me that when we get to 2022, really all the big guns are on the side of choice and on the side of abortion rights. And we can see that really in the culture all around us. For example, when Giorgia Meloni came to be leader of Italy, she said that she wanted to introduce a situation where women could have more children comfortably, because Italy's fertility rate is absolutely catastrophic, absolutely going through the floor, like most in Europe. She was immediately reprimanded by the European Union, and Elizabeth Bourne, the Prime Minister of France, said the first priority we have is to guarantee abortion rights. She was right to the fore about that. And the European Union, Macron himself wants to bring the right to abortion. He wants to make it a constitutional right, which I think is always a mistake, to make it a constitutional rather than look at it through normal legislation. And for example, in the fraught situation in the European Parliament, has suggested that refusal of abortion should be regarded as gender-based violence. In the United States, where indeed Margot referred to the complicated divisions that are there, Sheryl Sandberg, the boss of Facebook, has just announced that she will give $3.5 million to abortion rights campaigns in order to overturn the situation that it is, and she's indeed perfectly free to do so, as anybody else is free to lobby on the other side. I think that over the years, of course, I've seen many cases of compelling stories, many tragic stories, many empathetic stories, and as I describe in my book, how Ireland changed from being anti-abortion to accepting abortion rights. Really, this came about through the telling of stories and through people being sorry for young women who had to travel and so on. Because there are many arguments, indeed, absolutely, for abortion. There's only one argument against abortion, and that is, this is a human life. We know from conception, as science has told us, as science has shown us over and over again, that from conception we have a human life, and we have to take that seriously. If a man and a woman conceive of a human life together, they must ask themselves, do they have the responsibility to actually respect that human life and to allow it to live? This is a serious moral question. Of course there is autonomy, and of course there is agency, as we're always told. But even in the area of autonomy, let us remember there is also the factor of nature. Simone de Beauvoir herself, who was absolutely affirmative in favor of abortion rights, nonetheless said as soon as a woman is pregnant, she feels the power of nature within her. She actually described this rather disparagingly as making woman a servant of the species. But she says any woman who ever gets pregnant in any circumstance yields her autonomy, because nature is there and incubating a new life. So what I say is, take it seriously, respect the science of biology. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Dervla.
First of all, I'd like to thank the Battle of Ideas for inviting me to speak. I've attended this event now for several years, both volunteering and just kind of coming to watch. And I always think it's really challenging, and hopefully this panel will be exactly the same. In trying to kind of note down some opening statements of what I want to say, I've realised that I was kind of doomed, because there's so much within the realm of abortion to discuss that inevitably in 5 minutes you can't wrap everything up. So for sake of clarification, I would like to first state the statement that I am in favour of the decriminalisation of abortion, and then hopefully that will then become elaborated on through interactions with all of you. So yeah, for sake of clarification, I am pro-decriminalisation. I will also be referencing women seeking abortions, because it is generally women who are seeking abortions. And in addition to that, I think that terminology clarification, as Mary said, is very relevant and very important, because once you detach womanhood from abortion, I think that trivialises the discussion and removes it from its core, which is women's rights. So, yeah, I'd like to kind of start by discussing a case that was recently brought into the media when a woman with Down syndrome, Heidi Krauter, brought a case to the High Court against Sajid Javid on the grounds of discrimination, on the grounds of disability. She argued that allowing the abortion of a fetus with a diagnosis of a severe abnormality, which encapsulates Down syndrome as discriminatory. And I would like to make the probably quite controversial, well, it's not controversial statement. I think it is discriminatory, but I think her solution to that problem was misplaced. I think that the correct solution for the kind of quite arbitrary placement of timings for allowed abortion and legal abortion is to make abortion available at any time during a pregnancy for any reason. I don't think abortion should be gatekept by the state or by medical professionals. And I think it was a real shame that pro-choice campaigners went quite silent when that case was in the press. I thought it was a good opportunity to make the argument for decriminalisation by saying that, yes, the law is unequal, let's make it legal, not by reducing women's rights, but by extending them further. And rather than restricting women's choice and autonomy, we should extend it and trust women more than we do currently. And I think that there was a fear of being controversial in making that statement due to the sensitive topics and the kind of very personal nature of the discussion. So I'd be interested in what the audience and the panel have to say about that. And I think, you know, the discussion about buffer zones is also inevitably going to come up, I'm sure. It already was raised in the earlier discussion that Piers chaired on religious freedom and the right to protest outside abortion clinics. And it's a point that I really struggled to reason with. The whole point of the Battle of Ideas is to be pro-freedom of speech and pro-freedom of expression, but I do think that there comes a time and a point and a place where the right to protest infringes on a woman's right to access medical care. And I was reading just this morning that in Scotland, there's an anti-abortion charity that are training up protesters to kind of grab the attention of male partners of women seeking abortions as they wait outside clinics to go in and get the women to stop receiving that medical care. And there's also been exposed that various anti-abortion charities are encouraging the use of reversal pills that seek to kind of intervene in the process of an abortion, which has been widely deemed by the medical profession as unsafe. But kind of in wrapping up my opening statement, I would like to make the point that I think it's really important that we're here today. The case for abortion clearly isn't completely made. The fact that we're here and disagreeing and agreeing shows that we need to engage with the moral arguments for abortion. I'd quickly really like to plug Anne Farady's book, which is amazing and it's available at the book stand. But I think she makes the point really well that we need to engage in tough discussions, and that is what will make the pro-choice movement stronger. By avoiding discussions, we only weaken our stance. And I think that it's really important that we are here. And so I'd like to thank you all for coming. So, yeah.
Piers.
Thank you very much, Breed. I know that some people maybe have noticed that I'm the only man on this panel, and that some of you may be thinking that men have no right to talk on the issue. I would say, I'd say, first of all, how do you know I am a man? But even leaving that aside, I think we're dealing here with a moral argument, and I think we've now got past the stage when we're arguing about who has a right to speak. What's important is there are arguments, and I want to present some. All right, so in their opening presentations, Margot talked about the importance of choice, and Mary said finally that the issue is that we're dealing with a human being here, a living human being, and there is no right to kill a living human being. Now, no doubt Mary would reply to Margot when it comes to the point about choice. We could say, well, yes, but then laws exist to restrict people's choices when the choices they are making are wrong choices. And so the whole issue we're discussing here is whether the choice to have an abortion is a morally wrong choice, and the additional, very complex issue about what the law should say about the wrong choices we make, given that almost everybody in this room, if not everybody, accepts that there are certain morally wrong things that people do that should not be a matter for the police. I mean, in this society, if your spouse is unfaithful, that may be a bad thing to do, but you don't call 999 and say, I caught my wife flirting with somebody at a party.
Poor Connor Burns.
It was actually put, well, he's another matter. But anyway, this just makes a simple point. Law and morality, complex relationship. Oh, well, to get to the point, though, because I'm aware of the time constraints, there is a very familiar moral argument against abortion. It really underlies everything that's said. It goes like this. Premise 1, it is always wrong to kill an innocent human being deliberately. Premise 2, abortion is the deliberate killing of an innocent human being. Therefore, abortion is always wrong. Now, it's a perfectly valid argument. By valid, I don't mean the conclusion's true. I mean that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. Now, many people say, well, obviously it's not a sound argument. It may be valid in the sense the conclusion follows, but it's obviously silly to say that abortion is the deliberate killing of a human being. Well, I beg to disagree. It seems to me that whatever your position on abortion, morally speaking, there's something that all sides need to accept, however uncomfortable it is. Whatever the truth about it ethically, abortion, barring maybe the very early stages of pregnancy when there might be some debate, but abortion in the normal case is the deliberate killing of a human being. That's what it is as a matter of description. It is deliberate killing. People don't like to say this because the word killing has connotations of wrongness. And we don't think abortion's wrong, therefore we don't want to think it's killing. Psychologically understandable, but it's a fudge. What we need to do is say, yes, actually, abortion is deliberate killing, but what follows? It's not obvious what follows, because there are two very powerful arguments which are used to counter the logically valid argument I began with, and it is logically valid. If the premises are true, the conclusion is true. And the two arguments are this. First of all, even though the human conceptus or fetus or whatever stage it's at, even though it is a living human being, it is not a moral person. That's to say, just because you're a living human being doesn't mean you have all the rights that are normally due to the kind of human beings that we are in this room, or I hope we are anyway. And there are various accounts of why it might not be the case that a living human being is a person, but some are associated with a number of bioethicists and moral philosophers and others who will say, as the philosopher John Harris says, to be a person, i.e. to be owed moral respect that extends to respect for the right to life, to be a person, you have to be capable of valuing your own existence, capable of valuing your own existence. A fetus is, a fetus isn't capable. Right, all debatable. More commonly, though, people tend to say, well, it's not really about the moral status of the conceptus, it's more about the rights of the woman. And this, I think, is even more compelling, because what we've got here, you can see the structure of this, we've got a genuinely difficult moral problem here, because we have a clash of interests and of purported rights. For I have every sympathy with women who say, yes, okay, let's concede that we are dealing with a living human being here. However, it does not follow that in all circumstances, this human being has a right to live off her body. And that is what is at stake here. The right of a woman not to permit an admittedly living human being to live off her body, or at least not in all circumstances. Now, here we have an impasse, because the pro-life people, and I have some sympathy with them, I have to say some, they'll say, look, what you're doing is it's not just allowing something to die, you're deliberately killing it. This must be really relevant when it comes to whether you have a moral right to detach the fetus from your body. This is the real issue. I don't know how to solve it, which is why I'm slightly uncomfortable being on this panel. But I do want to say, look, we have to have the moral debate. We have to listen to each other without prejudice, to listen charitably, to understand where that is coming from, and then we can think more clearly about the law. Thank you very much.
Right, Piers has summed up very nicely what has been said on the panel, and I hope in the spirit of which he's invited that we'll have a very constructive discussion. Two there.
So I just wanted to sort of like zone in on this idea of the fetus being a human being. Like, I will accept it being a human life. It's human in biology and it is alive. But I don't think that with it being incapable of being separated from the mother, it is its own human being. Babies, when they're born, they can be, well, not ideal, can be separated from the mother and can live without the mother. But a fetus or a freshly conceived egg or whatever, that isn't a human being. And therefore, I feel like that makes it more... It's hard to say that you're killing a human being when it's not yet a being on its own.
Okay.
Hi. So obviously there's pro-choice versus pro-life, two clearly irreconcilable different moral positions. I don't take a position about which one should be primary. But what the problem here is that there's a third party involved here. You're imposing on a medical practitioner to effectively to break his Hippocratic oath as soon as the fetus becomes... I mean, as soon as you've got fertilised ovum as zygote, that is separate to the woman's body. It then eventually develops into something reasonably resembling a human being. And if you're asking a medical professional to intervene there to kill it, that is a problem. And the other complication here, of course, is since all the abortion laws are brought in, there's been massive changes in technology. We now have wee on a strip, easily, universally available, effectively very, very cheap, means of assessing month to month or even week by week what your fertility status is. Therefore, it's arguable that no woman can evade the responsibility of knowing at least month to month what a gestational fertility status is. These need to be factored into a discussion, and I think it does need to shift more onto the pro-life side than the pro-choice. There has to be a balance. There's no way you can easily get a perfect balance, but it has to shift from what it is now.
Thank you. I find it sort of quite bizarre to sort of hear. Thank you. So I find it quite bizarre to hear sort of argued on a public platform in the 21st century that we still don't know where life begins. I mean, if you look in any embryology textbook, I mean, it all says that's where fertilization is the point at which life begins. Whether you ascribe rights to that developing, we've heard languages like conceptus, etc., or not. There really is no argument that is the point that life does begin. And Piers' point, just with regards to, I think you quoted John Harris in terms of, well, yes, it's alive, but it hasn't sort of, it can't operate independently. I don't think it's any coincidence that the likes of John Harris, Michael Tooley, Peter Singer, they make the same argument in terms of, well, yes, if the developing unborn baby has not achieved some kind of right of independence, then it doesn't have the status of a moral person. Then quite consistently they make the arguments in terms of ex utero killing of newborn infants,
they do.
as well as others, comatose patients as well. It's really no coincidence, and it's not. I don't think it's a particularly sort of helpful or beneficial extension.
Thank you for the debate. Well, I think we're going down to much further than it maybe should be. Well, first statement, I am female, born. That means every time when I have sex, I could potentially be pregnant. Now, I use contraception, but no contraception is 100%. Because I use contraception, I don't test myself every time when I have sex next day. Now, what is the question here? As a female, I do not have sex unless I want to get pregnant. Is that what you hope me to do? Or because I want to have sex, well, so sign up being pregnant. Well, and now one day when I have sex and days later I find out that regardless of contraception that I use, I become pregnant. And now what? Tough, you vessel. Now get on with that. How about it's my body? That means I am no vessel. My body, as long as it's in my body, my livers, my lungs, everything else, It's mine. And once you take it, if that's also important, if you can take it out of me without killing me, so be it, have it. But as long as it's in me, it's my decision. And is that not as simple? And I'm making that decision for me regarding my body in sound mind. If that is a questionable, you have to prove that I'm not in sound mind. That is not as simple as that. And anybody else can make decision for them regarding their body, and I'm making decision for me regarding my body. How's
Thank
that?
you. Thank you.
I just wanted to take issue with Piers' very logical argument at the beginning, but the premises that you rest it on, you used the word killing of a human life, and you said that we should use that language because it's very emotive, but actually there are plenty of situations where we do choose to withdraw life because we stop supporting it when people are taken off life support or whatever. So I would say that's a fairer equation. That's more equal than it is to talk about killing it, which sounds like a very active thing rather than a withdrawal of support.
Yeah, why don't you?
Can I just say, first of all, Anne Furedi's indeed excellent book, The Moral Case for Abortion, is a very astonishing book because it is very honest. And she uses that phrase in the book. She says it will involve a killing. And I think that is a very honest thing for her to confront, even though she advocates completely the woman's choice in every situation. On the question of choice, I mean, I think that in reality, it's often much more nuanced than it can be in debate. For example, in Janice Turner in The Times wrote a little while ago that 20% of terminations, she's completely pro-choice, by the way, which take place in Great Britain, are actually happen because the woman or the couple have no proper support. They have no childcare, for example. They cannot see how they can actually continue their family life without childcare. And numerous abortions undoubtedly take place because of the lack of housing and accommodation. I mean, this is a very acute problem in this country, and also, as I know in my native Ireland, it's an absolutely appalling problem that young couples can't actually start families because they are because of the lack of accommodation. So there are choice often in real life. It often involves a very wide spectrum of complicated life situations. Now, I think it was Derval who mentioned the question of men outside abortion clinics. I wouldn't at all feel comfortable about joining any sort of protest outside an abortion clinic, but I have met people who say they have rescued women in the sense of offered them an alternative by being there and by bearing witness. So that does need more discussion. But I think it's interesting about men because again, I think it's Elizabeth Draper in her book on birth control in the modern world. Elizabeth Draper says, maybe this has changed in recent decades, but she says, wherever the man is supportive, a woman is more likely to proceed with a pregnancy. So there you have the notion, not of men as kind of toxic masculinity enforcing birth, but actually being supportive and helping a woman to fulfill her fertility, which is what many, many women want to do.
Okay. Piers, you want to come back on?
Yes, thank you. And many points were raised. I'll go through the ones that I had time to write down. The young woman at the front talked about how it's inappropriate to talk of having a human being. I think you said we have a human life, or was it the other way around? I wonder whether this is in the end a verbal dispute. We have a living entity. I think the point you're getting at is that it's not viable. It's not capable of survival outside the woman's body. Indeed, that's the case. Unfortunately, the pro-choice person then has a problem with the post-24 or so week visas that are viable. I mean, you can have a debate about that. But also, as people like John Harris says, and others will say, you need to explain why viability is the important criterion. Maybe it is, but I think too many people just say, oh, viability is the criterion. I'm never quite sure why. I mean, we need that actually discussed in more detail. On the question of embryology, about human life beginning at conception, well, I wonder whether the term life is being used with a hidden evaluation written into it, but assuming it's not, it's just being used descriptively, okay, but of course, the whole debate, the abortion debate's about whether the mere fact that a member of the species Homo sapiens or with human DNA is alive is a good moral ground for granting us an absolute right to life. And this, of course, is what the whole debate's about. Merely saying we have a human being here doesn't actually establish anything until you can establish the premises that would lead to the conclusion that you must never kill it. Those premises involve the idea that if something is a human being, it is sacred, i.e. that should never be taken deliberately. The gentleman over there was quite right to say that some of these more hard-line personists, if you like, people like John Harris, Peter Singer, the sinister Oxford utilitarians, as they're sort of nowadays known, they do bite the bullet, you're quite right. They say, yes, for the very reason that abortion's morally permissible, infanticide is at least in principle morally permissible because, neither the fetus nor the newly born child is capable of valiant existence. Now, the usual argument against that is to draw on an idea I didn't make much of, which is, I think, underpinning Mary's view, which is if something has a natural potential to become an adult human being with a full set of human rights because it's able to value its life, then it should be treated as if it were already had those rights. The natural potential argument is interesting, intriguing, plausible in certain contexts, not entirely in other contexts, so I'm not sure what to say about it. But I think the sort of argument you're advancing here depends on the sort of shock tactic approach, saying, you mean Peter Singer's argument implies it's okay to kill babies? In that case, it can't be okay to kill fetuses because it entails it's okay to kill babies. What you have to do there is just say, okay, you tell me why infanticide is always wrong. Tell me why. You think it's wrong because we've got a human being. Okay, that's sorry, I've gone on, but anyway.
Hi, I just want to comment on the Dobbs decision and the role that society plays.
Can you stand up, please?
And the role that society plays with abortion as well. So in my view, the Dobbs decision was entirely right because it restored the issue of abortion rights to the public sphere, to the public debate. And in 1973, you had a group of abortion campaigners who managed to convince a small group of 7 men that their worldview was the correct worldview and that worldview should be imposed on the rest of the United States without their democratic consent. So if the pro-abortion lobby believed that abortion was such a societal good, they should really do the work and win the argument, win the battle of ideas, and introduce a constitutional amendment or legislation, however, and amend the text of the Constitution via the Article 5 to explicitly grant women the right to vote. Right to an abortion, sorry. And then just a few questions on society. What does it say about the society that we live in, that the price of women's participation in civic life is the destruction of an unborn human being? And would the panel agree that when society repeats the mantra, my body, my choice, what they're really saying is, your body, not my problem?
Thank you. Was it you next?
Thanks. Thanks for the nice plugs about my book. I have to say, I was hugely influenced at an earlier stage of my career in abortion provision by Mary, actually, who made a point in a meeting that I was at about how useless the polarized discussion about abortion very often was. And she made the point, which was actually a very useful lesson for me, and it's something that I've really tried to stick with, that we should really consider the circumstances that women are in, and how often they're quite ambivalent about the decisions that you make. And I remember you saying to the meeting and to me that for many women, they often think that abortion is wrong, but they think it's the right thing to do in their circumstances. And I think that that is actually a very wise comment on the issue, because one of the frustrating things about the abortion debate is that it just is such a touch point. It spreads across these many things. If you think, I always think about it now as being like a Venn diagram, where you've got philosophy, you've got politics, and you've got personal, practical things, and it stretches across all of these various different areas, and it makes it almost impossible to do justice, even if there were like a whole course of this running throughout the day. And I think that what we all have to remember is that, you know, for women seeking abortion, they don't do it as a political standpoint. They really don't. They do it because of very contextual reasons that are going on in their life. And we can say, I would agree, the decision is often something that's more on a shade of grey than a black and white. But it doesn't mean it's any less valid because of that, because I think that typically, often women will say, I would prefer not to have an abortion. I would have this child if. But the if can be something as profoundly unsolvable as I would have this baby if I wasn't 16, or if I could get maternity leave or something, or it can be if my partner wanted to have the baby as well. But that if has got to be something that she has to negotiate, because she is the person who has to deal with it. And I think that, you know, I agree with you. I think that abortion is a profoundly moral issue. And young women on the platform have made the case for why I think a woman has to be the person to make that decision, because she is going to be responsible for it. She's responsible to herself for it. She's responsible for society. And the question that I would like to put for those people who think that abortion is wrong always and should never happen is, when do we think it is right to take away a competent woman's decision, to a competent woman's capacity? When can we overrule that competent woman's capacity to make a moral decision that refers most profoundly to her own life? Because we can talk about the fetus's right to life until we're blue in the face, but the one thing that we do know is that there is a living woman making moral decisions at the heart of it. Is when can we overrule that? Because I can't think of a single circumstance when I would want to happen.
I don't actually see why we're still debating abortion. It is not a debate, it's a right. So I just don't understand why we're still debating it and saying that, oh, well, the doctors, this, that, and the other. I'm sorry, but doctors kill, first of all, babies is not a person. But they kill people every day. They really do. And I just don't think it's fair to say that this, that, and the other, that it's wrong or right. There's no debate. We don't discuss other rights. We don't discuss whether we have the right to water or food. Abortion. It's your body. The baby is not a person. It is a cell.
Okay,
I don't understand how even like women as a whole, why are we still debating this? It is your body. It doesn't involve anyone else. So why would it's not your body, so why are people talking about it? Because if you don't have to go through it, you don't have to bring up the child. And to be fair, at the end of the day, if you have a child when you're young or not in a great state, that is ultimately going to affect the baby once it's born and its life.
Thank you.
I wasn't going to say anything about this, but I do just want to say I understand your frustration completely, but the reason that we have to debate it is so that we can continue to make the case. If we stop debating, and I am completely on your side, completely 100%, but if we stop debating this, then what happens when people come in and start trying to debate us and say, oh, you're not allowed this right? We don't have anything to say unless we prepare these arguments. So it is really important, but yeah, I agree with you. I wanted to say that I think that the issue that I think Piers posed, saying that this is a moral discussion, I agree, it is a moral discussion, but the moral isn't about the fetus. It isn't about the fetus. It is about liberty. It is about the independent right for every human being, not just women, but human beings, to do what they like with themselves. And that is so fundamental. And of course, women are at the forefront of that. But if we take away autonomy for women, that means that everyone else's autonomy gets stripped away from them. Or it means that the establishment can try to strip that away from them, which is what we ultimately should be fighting. And I would also like to just ask what the panel thought about the fact that I read a really heartbreaking story about in the UK. We've been discussing a lot about Roe v. Wade, about France. But in the UK, there are women in Scotland who have to drive down to Southampton to get the abortions that they need. Women who are in poverty, and especially with the cost of living crisis, you can't afford these petrol bills, and they have to come down because in Scotland, the rule is that I believe you're not allowed to have a pregnancy, you're not allowed to have an abortion in the 3rd trimester. Why aren't we talking about that when it's happening in this country? We need to.
After Roe v. Wade got overturned, I went online and looked at some opinion polls of different states, and I'm pretty sure I saw that some states there was a majority of banning abortions, and I think possibly even a majority of women wanted to ban abortions. I'm not quite sure about that. I wanted to know what the panel thought was that the best, most democratic process. Is it 7 people in the Supreme Court making the decision, or is it at a state level in America making their decision through elections, which could mean that that a state decides to ban abortion through a democratic process?
I'll come back to, I've circled 4 points I'd like to come back to, and 2 of them are from the first round. So the first one would be, gentlemen, your question about the medical practitioner and the oath they take. I think Anne said it really well. Where does the right of the mother disappear to when you're talking about this, about the right of the fetus? I disagree with you. I think that it is part of the woman. It's not a separate entity by itself. Yeah, I don't think the science will come into it because I'll move on to that. But I think Anne said it very well, so I'm just reiterating what Anne said. Again, plugging Anne's book. And for the next point, your question of when we don't know when life begins, I think I need to clarify my point. Life has been protected at different stages by different thoughts. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century his idea that fetus should be
14th century.
13th.
Yeah.
14th, 13th. I read 13th somewhere, but it might be 14th. Thomas Aquinas wanted to protect children from when they are animated not children, fetuses, when they are animated in the womb. And when the microscope was invented in the 17th century, the church changed this to be from when life begins at conception. So my argument is because this has changed, it's constantly changing our understanding of where life begins. I don't agree that a fetus or an embryo is a cluster of cells and that's all it is. We have to acknowledge the fact that it is a life. It is something, to some people, incredibly precious. But we cannot agree. What is prevalent and what prevails through history is a narrative of choice in people. And in the 12th century, I think there was a book in Spain written called Picaresco, and this was one of the first expressions of this choice. This was the first expressions of, I won't go on a tangent about that, but to me, what's prevalent is the expression of choice. What isn't is that life and how do I find when it begins has changed over centuries. So how can it be? How can we know when it's true? And I'll stop there because I'm taking up time.
I'd also like to come back to the point you made in the first round about by having abortion legal, you are forcing doctors to go against the Hippocratic Oath. I think it's very important that doctors are able to object to performing abortions. Therefore, their interpretation of the Hippocratic Oath will be their own. It's not imposed upon them. Because I think it's important that this kind of, and I suppose that is the ultimate point of decriminalising abortion. It's the point of non-judgment. Placing any restriction on abortion immediately places judgment on when is the right time to have an abortion. And so therefore, if you have no restrictions and only kind of medical regulation, you allow each person to make their own choice about when life begins, their own choice about what reasons are acceptable to access an abortion. I'd also like to come back to the person who was very passionate that there is no debate about abortion. We're here. I think that is the kind of the point that a lot of older pro-choice campaigners are making about the current pro-choice movement with our generation, that we're too binary. Ironically, for a generation that is so against binaries, seemingly in every way, we are kind of arrogantly binary about abortion. The debate isn't won, and it probably never will be on the moral grounds, because there is, as has been highlighted several times, a degree of irreconcilability. But the kind of point of pro-choice campaigners is that should be down to the woman to decide. And I think the whole discussion about, there is also equally on the other side, there is no debate that a fetus is a human, it is a life. There are people that disagree. I'm not saying I do. I think that there is something very important about a fetus. It is where we've all come from, and many women will go on to give birth, hopefully of their own volition. And I think that to then, where was I going with this point? Where was I going?
Non-binary.
Non-binary. Fetus as... I was going to reference Dr. Willie Parker. He, as an a Christian abortion provider in America, he always comments that you can't answer moral and kind of these moral questions with really stark scientific answers, because science disagrees, as Margot's already said. So, yeah.
So, three quick things. To Piers, if viability is the criteria, does that include newborns outside the womb? Arguably, that they're not viable because they still need to be cared for. So why are they protected but not the baby inside the womb? To Dervla, you said abortion anytime, any stage, any reason. Does that include up until the day right before birth? And also the third thing is the word fetus is used a lot, and I think it's just quibbling on saying it's a person. Because, throughout history, whenever people did mental gymnastics to argue what is and isn't a person, well, we judge them quite agreeably to be wrong. So why is the pro-abortion side any different now?
The original wording of the Hippocratic Oath does include, it's not interpretation, an explicit prohibition on the termination of pregnancy as it was in ancient Greece. And I think, and that's contradicted elsewhere in the so-called Hippocratic corpus, but I think that aspect of the original Hippocratic Oath is wrong, and doctors should feel quite free to contravene it. So I think it's worth being explicit about that. The other thing I wanted to say is that it is legitimate to unpack the meanings of the words living, human, and being. Some people have been doing that. Piers cautioned against it a little bit. Anne looks at that in her book, but her argument doesn't rest upon it. But you can legitimately unpack the meanings of those words. Life means more than one thing. Human means more than one thing. When someone says, and I work in embryo research, when someone says, look, we all know life begins at conception, it's scientific. Actually, no. Depends what you mean by life. Life, the words life and human have an animal meaning about things being biologically alive, about us belonging to the species Homo sapiens, and they have a more than animal meaning. And it's quite legitimate to say that that more than animal meaning is acquired after birth and not prior to birth. And then in that respect, what you have with an embryo or a fetus at any stage of pregnancy is not necessarily living, human, or being.
Yep.
I might be slightly emotive at this point. My daughter was just 16 when she lobbed her pregnancy test across the counter, across the dinner table. We gave her 4 choices. I'm quite pragmatic in my view. 1, she could go for an abortion. 2, she could strike out on her own. 3, or the 4th one was she could try and keep the baby. The 3rd one was adoption. The 4th one was she could keep her child and we would help her raise the child. My grandson is now 27 years of age. Now comes the rub. I worked in Brighton. There were more abortions in Brighton than there were live births. And we have a birth problem in this country. We have, the birth rate has gone and has tanked. So our society will be in trouble come 50 years down the line. That's one area of thinking about it. The other area I want to talk about is the effect an abortion can have on a man. I would ask the question of all of you in this room, have any of you ever had to pick up the pieces of a bloke who has tried to take his life because his partner has had an abortion without his knowledge? I have on a number of occasions. It ain't that simple. It isn't just a simple case of pro-life or pro-death. I am certainly not pro-death, but I'm sure it's also not just pro-life either. There are instances where a termination, abortion, whatever term you want to use, has to happen. It's almost an imperative. I will quote you an example which I had to pass a couple through. Couple, got 2 kids, both perfectly happy, trotting along, jogging along with life. They were both adopted. 3rd pregnancy comes along and the bomb goes off in their head. Where do I come from? And they decided to look for it. Both of them came from lines where there was a potential hereditary problem coming down the line genetically. There was a double whammy in their 3rd unborn child. And they decided to have that child terminated, aborted, whatever term you want to use. The people around me, and I was a pastor at the time, were absolutely horrified that I didn't condemn them. To which I said, where's your humanity, for crying out loud? It's not that simple. It's not so black and white. It's a much more emotive thing that we get involved in. And you can philosophise about it all day long. It's deeply emotive. And we need to get real with that, in my view.
So I think I come at this from a slightly different angle because I'm from Denmark, a country where abortion is rarely debated, and there is kind of a consensus that abortion is okay and that it should be legal. It's 12 weeks, like in many European countries. But the thing is, in Denmark, then 1/5 of pregnancies are terminated, and this is kind of mirrored with a youth culture that has very liberal sexual values. People sleep around. We have a hookup culture, basically, in our youth. And especially young men are quite reluctant to go along with contraception. There's a big I feel like in our youth culture, there is kind of this idea that that abortion is because it's easy to get, no one is against it, it kind of becomes a kind of contraception. And young men who don't want to wear a condom because it makes sex a bit less nice, kind of just think, oh, but here it's legal and easy to get an abortion. So, you know, it kind of like, and I think I want the panel to kind of discuss how, you know, I am totally for legal abortion and decriminalizing, but I wonder whether we should have kind of a cultural discussion about, you know, these very important points about, you know, it is a life and
Yes,
all these things, and whether we should be so flippant about it in a country like Denmark, where every child who was born, every one of those, would probably have a great life in our very social, like in our social welfare system that famously works really well. So yeah, that
Okay, well, just since I'm thinking on my feet, just on the last point about hookup culture, I mean, I think when you think about what caused what people call the sexual revolution of the 1970s, I mean, it began in the late 60s, I think the single most important causal factor behind that, whether it was good or bad, was the availability of contraception for unmarried women. Now, that is not to say I'm trying to condemn that or saying, well, isn't it shocking that in the 1960s contraceptive, but it is actually a causal factor. And what people said at the time, though I was too young myself to remember it, but I know people said at the time, well, once you have contraception available for unmarried women and we get rid of the moralism and Victorian prudery of past ages, there'll be no need for abortion because everybody used contraception. What is interesting, as Mary brought out, is that this simply didn't happen. In fact, the abortion rate massively rose after that time. I mean, we don't actually have figures for illegal abortions after 67, so maybe, and there must have been some because, but I mean, all the trends suggest that there was a massive rise. So you could, and morally, you could go two ways on this. You could take a very hardline position, which not many people find at all appealing or attractive, and say that the need for the problem of abortion is the problem of the need for abortion. That need will be almost entirely, not entirely, but largely eliminated if people kept sex to marriage, if marriage were permanent, if people were brought up to cultivate the virtues that make erotic love possible, all those things. Then, you know, and it's a big ask, but then, you know, morality itself is a big ask. Then the need would go away. There's truth in it. The trouble is people aren't going to behave in that way, and we have to have arguably provision for those who don't. The other points about, you know, what is it to be a human being? When does life begin? I mean, we've been debating about viability and is this a human life? To some extent, it is verbal. I mean, Sandy at the front, I think, nicely put what the issue is. It's philosophically unclear what's meant by life, humanity, human being, and so on. I mean, but as I said in my opening speech, that the most powerful and most, well, not powerful, but the most clear anti-abortion argument is the old one, which is that a human conceptus, or at some point very soon after conception, has a natural potential to develop into a rational person with a full set of rights and responsibilities. Natural potential, go back to Aristotle if you want to be pedantic about it, is already implicit, is already there in the nature of that thing. So even though the fetus or conceptus can't now claim its rights, it is of a kind that is essentially able to have rights and responsibilities. Now, I think it's very difficult metaphysically to know how to take this argument. Some examples make it plausible, others don't. I don't really buy it, though. I think just because something has a potential, even a natural potential to become a certain thing, doesn't mean it's murder now to cut this thing off. So if we're going to say it's murder, it must be for some other reason. I know people are shocked by the thought that infanticide might be permitted if abortion is permissible for the personhood reason, but maybe we have to bite that bullet. It does strike me, if you're going to argue for abortion, it's going to focus really on the women's rights argument. You're going to be saying, look, a woman has a right not to have to allow or not to allow another living entity to live off its body, off her body. Now, the counter-argument to that is going to be say, well, normally that's true, but here, exercising your rights not to allow the fetus to live off the body would entail deliberate killing. And deliberate killing is always wrong. And moreover, if you're going to say a fetus is just part of a woman's body, well, the counter-argument is, yes, if you're going to say that, but it's a very special sort of body, part of her body. It has a natural potential to become another person. That's really what's difficult. See, metaphysically, I know I'm a philosopher and I will talk pompously in this way and, bringing my subject to the order, but the philosophy is relevant here. The metaphysics is just very difficult on this question. And we haven't even got on to the law here. I thought there might be more discussion of law, but how do you form laws in conditions of moral uncertainty? This is what greatly bothers me about the whole thing. I mean, we know abortion law is actually a bit of a mess in this country. It may surprise you to know that abortion is still illegal in this country, by the way. It's just that it was made in 1967, lawful defences were constructed. So, in other words, it should be a defence against prosecution under either the 1861 Offence Against the Person Act or the 1929 Infant Life Preservation Act. It should be made a defence if two doctors agree that your mental and physical health are going to be compromised. And the details would require me to be very long-winded. But these, but we have to think about it, that's all.
I just say that, first of all, I'm very grateful we are having a debate, and I really pay tribute to the Academy of Ideas for doing this, because I really have appreciated what everybody has said. I've learned something from everyone, and I particularly appreciate, what the pastor said there, that about condemning. I don't think people should ever stand in judgment of any individual, and that's really a Christian sort of point of view. And, Anne touched on the whole point of ambivalence. And, I did a book about abortion back in the 80s, and I attended a whole lot of abortions as well. And I must say the late abortions were extremely distressing. But I did, come across that those feelings of ambivalence quite a lot with women. And there was one woman who was, I thought, particularly touching, where she said, I have to have this, I can't have this baby, I'll have to terminate the pregnancy. However, she gave up cigarettes between finding out that she was pregnant and actually getting the abortion because she didn't want to harm the baby. Mm-hmm. And so there was that in the woman herself, as de Beauvoir's pointed out, there was already that instinct to sort of protect. Now, the exam question was the future of abortion rights. You can never predict the future. I think that abortion rights are very well embedded, actually, all over Europe. And I think probably it's quite hard for pro-life people to be in the public square at all sometimes. I mean, when Therese Coffey was made the Secretary of State for Health, some abortion advocates said she shouldn't be allowed to be in this position because she was a Roman Catholic. And I can see the point where Roman Catholics won't be allowed to speak freely on this issue because it has become an orthodoxy. But I think there are two issues that I think in the future will influence. One is that whatever you call the unborn or the fetus, embryology is discovering all the time. And it's fascinating to me seeing younger generation people. The minute they find they're pregnant with a baby they want, the first thing they do is put up a picture and put it on the internet and send you a picture of this. And my own grandchildren, that I saw them pictured on the screen when they were when my daughter-in-law was just 8 or 10 weeks pregnant. So that image that this is a living, I didn't say a living being in my original, I said a human life, that this is a human life, is there in science, in biological science. I think the second piece of pressure that will come is this fall in fertility, which is all over Europe, all over the developed world, and demographers are creating a lot of concern. And if you say that, Denmark, which this young lady mentioned very, very thoughtfully, Denmark is actually, the government has advertised to couples, stay at home this afternoon and make a baby. They're sort of trying to get couples to go to bed together and make a baby at the same time. And the Finnish government, of course, this notion of are you going to enforce a woman to be pregnant? I don't think that's going to happen at all. But I think there will come a series of sort of persuasive measures where I think it's the Minister for Population in Finland who spoke recently about this on Radio 4, and she said, we really need to make an effort to be encouraging, to provide facilities, to be positive about pregnancy, and to give women and couples the chances to go forward and have babies. And that's not abrogating, certainly in Finland, the right to choose, but there are ways of trying to be positive about the beauty of life.
Thank you.
So, the question that was directed at me as to whether I think abortion should be available up till birth, yes. I think I can come back to a lot of the points that have been raised with the kind of the argument of autonomy. I think especially the gentleman in blue who said he gave his daughter 4 choices. I proposed to you that the choice wasn't yours to make. I think it's very important to advocate for each individual's autonomy, and you also raised the kind of the issue of the man in all of this. Men being upset, and I argue that is their responsibility. If I become pregnant, well, I'm gay, so there won't be a man involved, hopefully, but a male partner. But I think that
She'll need a guy.
Each man is responsible for his own reaction. That's not a woman's responsibility to deal with that. And so I think to put that on pregnant women is a very damaging thing to do, to make women responsible for men's reactions. And finally, to the guy who hijacked the Q&A about late-stage abortion, late-stage abortion is really often kind of weaponized by anti-abortion campaigners as something that's going to become really common. It won't. No woman wants a late-stage abortion. It's something that is... It can, but what is the alternative? Forced birth. So instead of, I think it's, so let me summarise briefly. I think up until the point where the fetus is no longer an inhabitant of the woman, that is her choice alone what to do with it. Once you give birth to a fetus, other people can intervene. But I think forced birth as the alternative to legal and kind of free abortion is, one, much more medically risky for women, and two, really damaging for where we place women in society. So yeah, I'll let Margot speak.
I'll keep mine really briefly because I think you've summarised a lot of what I wanted to say. I want to acknowledge what was talked about briefly yesterday in the last session about Bye Bye Baby and the gentleman in the blue shirt about birth rate. I think it's really, really dangerous to talk about women not having an abortion rights because for the greater good, this idea of greater good, of being coerced into having children for the population. I think it's an insincere decision, and it does not reflect. I keep going back to the same point of it's not a sincere choice that the woman makes as an individual in a society that is based on that individual right of the right democratic right. And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, so there's a very serious issue that I don't think is being discussed enough, and it's this. If abortion is made illegal, let's forget all of the other arguments. What happens to all of the unwanted newborns who are now left out onto the street? The pro-life position is not pro-life, it is pro-birth. Right now, 25 million women and girls are don't have access to safe abortion. And we seem to forget that if we make abortion illegal, it won't end abortion, it will end safe abortion. And the gentleman there talks about married couples. Not all married couples want to have children. Abortion was initially legalized in the UK by a man named Enoch Powell, and I'm sorry, it was nothing to do with feminism. The feminists have co-opted abortion, but it's not about feminism. It's about liberty, and it's about humanitarianism. And I myself am morally opposed to abortion, and I agree that the feminists don't really care about what the men should have a say in it as well, I agree, but we need to, at the end of the day, acknowledge that getting rid of abortion will not stop abortion, it will simply stop safe abortion. It must be there. And women do need to take responsibility. We do need to take responsibility. Contraception is important, but we still need to have abortion there, safe, legal, and rare. Thank you.
As a woman in my 20s, I wonder if the cultural drive to champion abortion is giving us a blind spot to the inequalities that abortion exposes about women and also places on women. And Mary, I appreciated so much of what you had to say, but you also said that the human life of the child is the only argument against abortion. And I don't think that's right. I think there's another argument in that abortion itself is bad for women. Acclaimed pro-choice psychological scholar David Ferguson has conducted a meta-analysis of all of the links of abortion and mental health. He found that it raised the chances of anxiety, depression, suicidal behavior, alcohol misuse, and drug misuse. No little girl grows up wanting to have abortion. It's never the ideal outcome for anyone. But women in deprived areas are almost 3 times more likely to undergo abortions in their lifetime. And as our learned friend wisely pointed out, in New York, more black babies are aborted than born. We know this is affecting those of us in society who are less well off, less privileged. So what if we were able to solve some of the ifs that Anne raised? If I could have maternity care, if I could access to support, nappies, all these things, why don't we, as an equality movement, as a feminist movement, be looking to make abortion unnecessary? Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah. Obviously, as a guy, I feel like it's quite important that I get my point
Can you
across.
speak into the mic a bit more,
Sorry.
please? Thanks.
Yeah, as a male, I feel like it's quite important that I get my point across as well. I do sort of disagree with what the lady on the right said about a man not really having that much of an important say in his woman's decision as to whether or not she can abort. I do believe that a man should have an important say, as my Christian brethren also brought up. The man should have a say, but it shouldn't be the final say. It should be, you can have a say, but if you decide to have the baby and I do not wish to, then you should try and at least leave me out of it. I am religious, but I also do believe that the woman should have the choice to abort should she decide to, and it shouldn't be imposed from either side upon the other. So there should be an even 50-50 split, because if the child is born, it's a 50-50 split on the relationship and the roles that are played in raising that child. So there should also be a 50-50 split on whether or not that child is brought into the world.
Things would be a lot easier in this debate, which I do think is important, if people were more honest, I think. And I think there's a huge... I don't understand when people who are clearly religious won't even mention God. If they are against abortion because they believe in God's will rather than the woman's will, why not argue it in those terms? Give it a go. People used to do it. And I do think that otherwise we end up with moving to social justice, anti-racism, mental health harms, and it just becomes an incredibly slippery topic, which I think is a tactical, is a tactic on behalf of the anti-abortion lobbies. And I think it would be far easier if they just said, we think that the world should be more godly and we would prefer more people to act in the way that we think they should act. And, then you'd have to persuade people to your way of life. And if you can't do that, then I'm not quite sure what you plan to do. I mean, are you going to protest more clinics? Are you going to obstruct more women? I don't know what the solution will be if you're not going to achieve a more godly world.
I just wanted to comment on, I feel like the debate amongst the audience has been quite uncharitable to men. I think this man's point over here was a legitimate point, and I think that perhaps your interpretation was a little bit unfair. I really respect what you've done and what you've spoken about, and I disagree with you, but I think, you said your daughter was 16, did you say? Yeah, so I mean, but what I'm saying is that, he said, I gave my daughter 4 choices. I think that as a father, he had a responsibility, and I think it's unfair to just say, oh, you gave her 4 choices. And to this guy here, like, Christian, non-Christian, this doesn't really matter. Like, the father is involved in this as well. I think we shouldn't just flippantly dismiss the man. They should be involved, and it's really, really sad. I know lots of guys who feel desperately they want to have a child with their partner, and their child may be very against that. And I think we need to respect the men in this too, and don't just pretend it's a women's issue. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm afraid that's all from the floor. We're just going to give the panelists one point, please.
One sentence. I'm going to focus on, as Mary did, the future of abortion rights. And I'm going to reiterate what I said at the beginning. This can only be resolved by a society. This can only be resolved by letting society choose, by letting through a democratic process for society to choose and to vote or to rely on who they've elected. But that, to me, is the only way that we can resolve the legality of it. The morality, someone made a good point of the morality of it may never be resolved, but the legality of it can.
We can applaud them all at the end.
I just say briefly, actually, in answer to the lady who's just spoken, you can be a person of faith, but you can also be a person who believes biological evidence. I don't actually place my credence about the human life on St. Thomas Aquinas, although he was a very interesting theologian who had a very good, some very good thoughts about the just war. But it was really, to me, the revelation that came. It all comes from embryology and science, and seeing for myself that this was a human life. At the same time, as I said before, I think we should, women often face very difficult circumstances. There are some very difficult times, and I think women are not, I would like to see a society in which women are much more supported to go forward to motherhood, and that it shouldn't be such a difficult obstacle race in so many cases where women have to sacrifice something which is really rewarding for so many women, because society has constructed things in a way which just makes it so difficult.
Thank you.
I'm going to, again, focus on kind of the future of abortion rights, and especially in the UK, and express that there is progress. The fact that we're having this debate, there is progress. The fact that telemedical abortion is now available from home, there is progress. But abortion is still a criminal act, as Sandy has already mentioned. And I think that we need to, as the pro-choice side, need to keep gaining momentum. We can't become complacent with where we are now. And I think for a choice to be autonomous, as I think everyone in this room will hopefully support being at this event, that there needs to be an absence of external influence as much as possible, and the state imposing its judgments on women does not allow that. Therefore, I think for women to be the freest they can be in a society, we have to be free to access abortion as and when and for whatever reason we choose, because we are the ones that will end up dealing with the fallout. Everyone discussing men is great, but I think you give a lot of men too much credit. And, men are... Okay. Men can leave. Men can leave.
Okay. Here's final word briefly.
Thank you. Well, just to say again what I said before, I'm not trying to say that philosophical or ethical reasoning will solve the issue, but it is very important as part of solving the issue. I mean, you can debate whether the sort of reasoning I talked about is relevant at all, not just to this question, but to any moral question. But I think we need to try to reason about this as well as possible. We need to be aware of bogus arguments which are convenient in this context but would never pass muster elsewhere. For example, arguments that appeal to the alleged mental ill effects on women's mental health of abortion, or indeed of abortions on women's male partners. I mean, this sort of argument might just as well be applied against mastectomies or hysterectomies. Women should never have hysterectomies. Look at the number of people who suffer dreadful mental health, but sometimes it may be medically necessary. And similarly, in the case of abortions, it may be morally, at least arguably morally necessary in those cases. So we need to strip away this sort of thing and get to the issue. The issue is we have a conflict or potential conflict of interests or rights. We have a very strong presumption that no woman should be made to, or indeed is obliged to, let even another person live off her body. That's a very powerful argument. We should grant it. We should also grant that there's something different about abortion because there is at least an entity that has a natural potential to turn into a person, as we are. And this is at least arguably morally important, but the metaphysics is incredibly difficult and controversial. That's why we need to go on discussing it without prejudice. As to religion, by the way, in a way, I know that people who take a pro-life position, often they are religious, but it's not dishonest of them to separate that from theology, because they do think, especially if they're Catholics who believe in natural law, they do think you can discuss these things in a non-religious way. My own suspicion, though, when it comes to the fundamental doctrine of the sanctity of human life, and this is what's doing the moral work here, it is the doctrine of the sanctity of human life. My suspicion is that in the end, there can't be a purely secular defense of that. You probably do have to refer to something like a divine purpose for distinctively human beings. But I'm just throwing that spanner into the works. I can't develop it now. Thank you.
Thank you all.